Hi everyone, today we're going to go over the second part of the Organizing Ideas worksheet. So last week you worked on kind of integrating and synthesizing your sources to identify your common themes. And this week you're going to work to create a more detailed outline of your paper to really figure out where things are going to go. Remember that you might revisit some of the earlier steps on the Organizing Ideas worksheet part 1. So we talked about last week, if you find new sources or realize you need more information about your topic, you're welcome to go back. In this outline, the order of your arguments needs to be clear, and you really need to figure out what evidence you have to support each one of your arguments. So the basic structure is outlined below, and then the following page has a template for you to use. So in your introduction is going to be your first section of your paper, and you need to provide background information about the topic and its significance, and the very end, the last sentence of your first paragraph should be a statement of your thesis. Your thesis needs to be an argument that you are making. So it can't just be, I'm going to talk about ADHD. Your thesis needs to focus on some aspect and make an argument. It can be as simple as ADHD has negative effects for social and emotional development. But it needs to be some kind of argument that you're going to, quote unquote, prove in your paper. Next, the bulk of your paper is going to be the body, and it's going to demonstrate your understanding of the current literature and organize the information around the themes that you identified in the first part of the worksheet. For the most part, these themes may be 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's not necessarily set to a paragraph. But I think the thing to note here is that in this very general example, we've got the 3 themes. And if you remember in the last example, I think I used friendship and victimization and exclusion as my 3 themes. But note that I have different sources under each theme, but the arrows kind of indicate that you're going to move back and forth between the sources. So what you do not want, and this is a tendency that a lot of students have, is to basically write 1 paragraph summarizing source 1, a second paragraph summarizing source 2, and a third paragraph summarizing source 3. That is not what I want you to do here, because the goal here is really to synthesize the literature, meaning that you're organizing it around the themes and saying everything that anyone has said about your first theme and then anything that anyone has said about your second theme. So you will be moving back and forth between papers. So you might make a statement like, some evidence has shown that the more teachers smile, the more likely their students are to develop friendships. And if you have 2 different sources that have found something similar, you'll cite them both. And then you may go on to something more detailed, like it also shows that teachers who smile more have more positive classroom climate, and cite one of those sources which looked at that in detail. So the goal here is to organize your paper around the ideas in the literature you've read, rather than to organize it around the specific articles. So the goal is to be talking about the ideas in the papers, not about the papers themselves. So this is a tricky process. So the hope is that by the last worksheet and organizing your themes, and this one organizing your outline, you will move away from focusing on each paper specifically and instead focus on the content of the paper. Another thing to note in this very general example, you may cite sources in multiple places. Okay, so this person has cited source 2 under theme 1 and theme 2 because source 2 addresses both of those themes. Same for source 1 is under theme 1 or theme 2 and theme 3. So it is okay to use an article in multiple different places. It's also okay to ignore pieces of an article that aren't relevant. So it's okay if there's just one tiny section of an article that you think is really useful to ignore the rest of the paper. Nothing is obligating you to write about the entire paper. You use those pieces of information in a way that's relevant to you. Okay, so the big challenge is the body of the paper, and then of course you'll have a conclusion at the end that kind of summarizes and kind of looks forward. What is research not addressing? What are the big picture things that we need to think about? And we'll work on that a little bit later on. Okay, so for what I want you to do, I've given you a template, and you can edit this to create your own outline using the themes that you identified on the previous worksheet. Bolded out items are things that absolutely need to be in your outline, but you should edit the titles and the topics to things that are appropriate for your paper. This outline needs to be at least 2 pages. Generally, what I found is the longer the outline is, the closer it is to the actual paper and the better off a student is. All of your subpoints, so any of the lettered bullets here, should be in full sentences. You don't 1 or 2 word points is not going to be helpful for you. I really want you to be kind of expanding your ideas and figuring out what you're going to say. I've given you a general idea of how to use each section, but you should actually fill in the content and ideas. You need to be using citations here. Use them in the APA format like you would to cite an in-text citation, because the goal here is to really figure out where your sources are going to go. And so you can and should add more topics or sections. This is just to give you an idea of how I want it formatted. So your introduction. You're going to have a section that's going to be the introduction. You need to make a general statement of a broad topic. Do not leave general statement of broad topic in what you submit. I want you to say something like, teachers have a big impact on their students' social relationships. List the relevant statistics that you think you might include, or the relevant pieces of information that you might include. Then you need to list your thesis statement, a clear thesis statement that, again, needs to make an argument. It can't just be this paper will be about teachers and the classroom. It needs to be something to the effect of teachers can have a positive or negative impact on students' peer relationships. I'm making an argument here that teachers matter. And then you're going to have your different sections. So the themes that you identified in the part 1 of the worksheet will probably be the names of your sections, although not necessarily. You may have more. You're going to make the points and list the citations that go with this point. And this is important because the whole point of this paper is to support your thesis. So after each section, you want to identify why this theme or this section supports your thesis. So you always want to come back to your thesis statement. So if my first section was on friendship, and so I'm talking about my different articles about friendship, I'm going to end this with something like, thus evidence suggests that teachers can significantly positively impact children's friendships. I'm going right back to my thesis statement. Section 2 in the example I gave you might be victimization, and again I'm going to talk about my different points, list my citations, and then come back to why does this support my thesis. This should be section 3, but you get the idea. Section 4 is the counter argument. You need to have some kind of counter argument. So this is important. You should not call it the counter argument, but this should be something kind of giving a nod to the evidence that contradicts your thesis. Okay, so something like, so if my thesis is teachers can have an impact on children's peer relationships, maybe my counter argument is something like, but some evidence shows that parents are the most important for children's peer relationships. You don't need a ton of evidence for this. 1 or 2 articles is fine, but you need to acknowledge that there are other perspectives and give some citations for this. And again, your counterargument doesn't have to be the complete opposite of your thesis, but in the example I gave you, it's not that teachers don't matter, which could be a counterargument, but it's just that, oh, hey, something else might also be important. But then you end your counterargument going back to your thesis statement and saying why this is wrong. Yes, although parents do seem to have an impact, teachers are present when children are interacting with their peers and therefore still play a significant role. And then you'll come to your conclusions. First thing you do in your conclusion section is reiterate your thesis and then take into account the bigger picture, the take-home message. Why does this matter? So again, your outline, each of these points, other than the section name, should be full sentences. You really want to go into detail on what exactly the argument you're making is. The longer the outline, generally the more prepared you are to write. The more effort you put in at this point, the easier it's going to be to write your paper, the easier it is to identify where you're missing stuff and where you need to fill stuff in. So it's worth taking the time to really make a strong, solid outline to be sure that you are prepared.